deep in the archives of medieval monasteries, tucked away in forgotten corners of European libraries, and whispered about in the shadowed halls of secret societies, there exists a bloodline so explosive, so dangerous to the established order, that for over 1,000 years, powerful forces have worked tirelessly to erase it from history. They call themselves the guardians of truth, but what they've really guarded is the greatest cover-up in Western civilization. Tonight, we're going to uncover the true story of the Merovingian bloodline, not the sanitized version you might find in a history textbook, but the real story, the one that makes kings tremble, that forces churches to rewrite their sacred narratives, and that threatens to topple the very foundations of how we understand power, divinity, and the secret architecture of European history. But before we dive into this rabbit hole that goes deeper than you could possibly imagine, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why certain royal families seem to appear out of nowhere, wielding impossible influence? Why some bloodlines are celebrated while others are systematically erased from every record, every chronicle, every stone tablet that might bear their name? What if I told you that there's a reason the phrase royal blood sends chills down the spine of those who truly understand history? What if the blood we're talking about isn't just metaphorically royal, but carries within it a secret so profound that entire empires have been built to suppress it? The Merovingians weren't just another medieval dynasty. They were the keepers of something far more dangerous than gold, more precious than land, more threatening to established power than any army that ever marched across Europe. And when you understand what they represented, you'll never look at European history the same way again. Here's what's going to shock you. Every major historical turning point in Western Europe for the last 1,500 years, every seemingly random shift in power, every mysterious disappearance of documents and bloodlines, has been connected to this single thread. The rise of the Carolingians, the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, the Crusades, the formation of secret societies, even the French Revolution, all of it traces back to one question that the powers that be never wanted answered. What really happened to the Merovingian kings? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand the cover-up, you first need to understand what was being covered up. And trust me, once you see the evidence we've uncovered, once you understand the lengths to which certain institutions have gone to bury this truth, you'll realize that some secrets are so dangerous, they reshape the world just by existing. So let's start at the beginning, in the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Gaul, where a king emerged from the shadows carrying a bloodline that would terrify empires for 1,000 years. The year was 457 AD, and the Roman Empire was crumbling. Across the vast territories that had once bowed to Caesar's eagles, barbarian tribes were carving out new kingdoms from the bones of the old world. But in the dense forests of what would become France, something different was stirring, something that didn't fit the pattern of crude tribal conquest. His name was Childeric, and he would become the first historically documented Merovingian king. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the first threads of the cover-up begin to show themselves. Unlike other barbarian chieftains who rose to power through military might alone, Childeric possessed something that set him apart, something that made even battle-hardened Roman generals treat him not as a conquered barbarian, but as an equal. What was it about this one man that caused Roman patricians to seek alliance rather than dominance? What did he carry that made his bloodline so special that it would echo through European history for the next 8 centuries? The official histories, the ones written by monks centuries later, the ones that survived the systematic purges, tell us that Childeric was simply a successful war leader, a footnote in the transition from Roman Gaul to Frankish kingdoms. But if you dig deeper, if you examine the archaeological evidence that wasn't destroyed, if you read between the lines of the few uncensored documents that survived, a very different picture emerges. Childeric's tomb was discovered in 1653-inch Tournai, Belgium. What they found inside should have rewritten European history. Should have, but didn't. Because by then, the cover-up was already well underway, and certain institutions had grown very skilled at explaining away inconvenient truths. The tomb contained treasures that defied explanation. Not just the gold and jewels you'd expect from a barbarian king, but artifacts that suggested connections to bloodlines and traditions that supposedly didn't exist in 5th century Gaul. Symbols that pointed to knowledge that shouldn't have been available to a simple tribal chieftain. Objects that suggested Childeric wasn't just a king, but the inheritor of something far more ancient and far more significant. But here's the truly chilling part. Within a century of its discovery, most of those artifacts had vanished. Stolen, they claimed, lost to thieves. How convenient that the most historically significant archaeological find in French history just happened to disappear before proper scholarly analysis could be conducted. What survived, what they couldn't make disappear, was enough to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions that powerful institutions weren't ready to answer. Questions about bloodlines that traced back beyond recorded history. Questions about why this particular family carried symbols and knowledge that suggested they were the inheritors of something that predated Christianity in Europe. Childeric's son, Clovis, would become the most famous of the early Merovingian kings. And this is where the story becomes not just historically significant, but politically explosive. Because Clovis did something that changed the entire trajectory of European civilization, something that created both the power and the vulnerability that would define the Merovingian legacy. In 496 AD, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity, not Arian Christianity, which was the preferred faith of most Germanic tribes, not some form of pagan compromise. Full Catholic Christianity, the same faith practiced in Rome. This single act created the first major Catholic kingdom in post-Roman Europe, and it established a precedent that would shape the relationship between church and state for the next 1,000 years. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Clovis's conversion wasn't a moment of spiritual awakening on a battlefield, as the church chronicles claim. It was a calculated political move that came with conditions that were so explosive, so threatening to later church authority, that they had to be erased from every official record. The deal that Clovis struck with the Catholic Church wasn't just about religious conversion, it was about recognition. Recognition of something the Merovingians carried, something that gave them not just political legitimacy, but spiritual authority. Something that made them not just kings appointed by the Church, but kings with their own divine mandate. And this is where the cover-up really begins. Because what the Merovingians possessed, what they represented, was fundamentally incompatible with the model of church authority that would later dominate medieval Europe. The Church needed kings to derive their power from papal approval, from divine right mediated through ecclesiastical authority. But the Merovingians claimed something different, something that bypassed the Church entirely. They claimed to carry the blood of kings who ruled by divine right that came from their bloodline itself, not from any earthly institution. They claimed to be the inheritors of a sacred kingship that traced its authority back through bloodlines that connected them to the very foundations of divine power on earth. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like typical medieval royal propaganda. Every king claimed divine right. Every bloodline invented glorious ancestry. What made the Merovingians different? What made their claims so dangerous that they had to be not just defeated politically, but erased from history itself? The answer lies in what they could prove. The artifacts in Childeric's tomb weren't just symbols of power, they were symbols of connection. connection to bloodlines and traditions that, if verified, would have fundamentally altered how Europe understood authority, legitimacy, and the very nature of divine kingship. For 2.5 centuries, the Merovingian kings ruled the Frankish kingdoms with an authority that seemed to transcend normal political power. They weren't just obeyed, they were revered, not just by their own people, but by neighboring kingdoms, by the church itself, even by the remnants of Roman authority that still flickered in various corners of Europe. Contemporary chronicles describe something about the Merovingian presence that set them apart from other rulers. They spoke of a quality that made even their enemies reluctant to raise weapons against them. They wrote of a bloodline that carried within it something that commanded respect, not through fear, but through recognition of some indefinable authority. But power that can't be explained is power that can be questioned. And by the 8th century, there were forces within the Frankish kingdoms that were very ready to start asking those questions. Forces that had their own plans for power and their own understanding of how divine authority should flow through European society. The mayors of the palace, the Carolingians, had been growing in power for generations. They controlled the military, they managed the administration, they held the real functional power, while the Merovingian kings maintained the ceremonial and spiritual authority. It was an arrangement that worked until it didn't. Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, was the first to seriously challenge not just Merovingian political power, but the entire concept of Merovingian legitimacy. His victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 wasn't just a military triumph over Muslim invaders. It was a demonstration that the Carolingians could command divine favor in battle without needing Merovingian royal authority to legitimize their actions. But even Charles Martel, for all his power, couldn't simply declare himself king. The Merovingian bloodline still carried too much weight, too much recognition, too much of whatever indefinable quality had made them special for centuries. Something more subtle was needed. Something that would transfer not just political power, but the very concept of legitimate rule itself. This is where the story becomes not just about medieval politics, but about the systematic rewriting of history itself. Because what happened next wasn't just the replacement of one royal family with another. It was the careful, methodical erasure of the very idea that the Merovingians had ever been anything more than a minor footnote in the rise of European civilization. The process began with Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son. In 751, he took a step that hadn't been attempted in European politics for centuries. He formally deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and claimed the Frankish crown for himself. But Pepin was smart enough to know that simply seizing power wasn't enough. He needed legitimacy. He needed the same quality that had made the Merovingians unquestionable for 3 centuries. So he did something unprecedented. He asked the Pope to anoint him as king, not just to recognize his authority, but to literally sanctify it with holy oil, to make his kingship not just politically legitimate, but spiritually mandated by God himself. This was the moment that changed everything. Not just for the Carolingians, not just for the Frankish kingdoms, but for the entire future of European civilization. Because in that single ceremony, the balance of power between bloodline and institution shifted forever. The Pope, by anointing Pepin, established that legitimate kingship came not from ancient bloodlines, not from inherited divine authority, but from church recognition. Kings would rule by the grace of God, but that grace would be mediated through papal approval. It was a revolutionary concept that placed the church at the center of all legitimate political power in Europe. But there was a problem. A big problem. The Merovingians were still alive. Childeric III, the last official Merovingian king, didn't simply fade into obscurity when Pepin claimed the crown. He was quietly shuffled off to a monastery, his head shaved in the ritual tonsure that marked him as a monk rather than a king. His children disappeared into religious life. The bloodline that had ruled for 3 centuries was officially extinct from political power. But here's what the official chronicles don't tell you. Monasteries in medieval Europe weren't just places of religious contemplation. They were repositories of knowledge, centers of learning, and most importantly for our story, they were places where inconvenient people could be kept under careful watch while the world moved on without them. The surviving Merovingians weren't just praying and copying manuscripts in those monastery cells. They were preserving something. Documents, genealogies, artifacts, and most dangerously of all, the knowledge of what their bloodline actually represented. Because you see, deposing a king is one thing. Erasing the memory of why that king's family had been considered sacred for centuries is something else entirely. And this is where the cover-up shifts into high gear. Because the Carolingians, for all their newfound papal legitimacy, had a problem that wouldn't go away. People remembered. The old nobles remembered pledging oaths to Merovingian kings that felt different from ordinary political allegiance. The common folk remembered stories passed down through generations about the long-haired kings who carried something special in their blood. The church itself had records of the original agreements made with Clovis that granted the Merovingians not just political recognition, but spiritual authority that bypassed normal ecclesiastical hierarchy. Charlemagne, Pepin's son, understood this problem better than anyone. When he was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800, he wasn't just claiming political succession from the old Roman Empire. He was making a statement about the nature of legitimate rule that directly contradicted everything the Merovingians had represented. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be known, was built on a revolutionary idea that ultimate political authority flowed from God through the Pope to the Emperor and down through the feudal hierarchy to every level of European society. It was a clean, clear chain of command that left no room for competing sources of divine authority. But revolutionary ideas, even when backed by the most powerful institutions in Europe, don't erase inconvenient truths overnight. They require sustained effort. They require the systematic rewriting of documents, the careful editing of chronicles, and most importantly, they require making sure that anyone who might remember the old truths understands that remembering them publicly is extremely dangerous. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians call it, wasn't just about preserving classical learning and promoting education. It was about controlling information. Every monastery that copied manuscripts did so under Carolingian oversight. Every chronicle that recorded history did so with Carolingian approval. Every document that survived from the Merovingian period survived because it didn't threaten the new narrative of legitimate rule. And here's where the story gets truly chilling. Because the manuscripts that didn't support the new narrative didn't just disappear randomly, they disappeared systematically. Entire libraries worth of Merovingian-era documents vanished during the Carolingian period. Genealogies that traced bloodlines back beyond recorded history were lost to mysterious fires. Chronicles that described the special qualities of Merovingian kingship were destroyed in Viking raids that somehow targeted only specific sections of monastic libraries. But some things are too important to trust to a single location. Some secrets are too dangerous to record in only one place. The surviving Merovingians, scattered across European monasteries and hidden in noble families that had intermarried with the royal bloodline, understood this. They developed networks of preservation that operated below the level of official church and state scrutiny. These networks weren't just about preserving documents, they were about preserving bloodlines themselves. Because whatever the Merovingians carried, Whatever made their royal authority different from ordinary political power, it wasn't something that died with the last official king. It was something that could be passed down through carefully maintained genealogical lines, even if those lines could no longer claim thrones. The evidence for these preservation networks is scattered across Europe, hidden in plain sight in places where the official authorities either couldn't look or didn't think to look. Noble families with unexplained connections to Merovingian symbolism, religious orders with unusual privileges that seemed to bypass normal church hierarchy, artisan guilds with initiation rituals that incorporated elements that predated Christianity in Europe. By the time the Crusades began in 1095, these networks had had 3 centuries to develop, to spread, and to evolve. And this is where the Merovingian bloodline story intersects with some of the most mysterious and powerful organizations in medieval Europe. The Knights Templar, officially founded to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, developed connections and accumulated knowledge that went far beyond their stated mission. They became the bankers of Europe, the holders of secrets that made kings and popes nervous, and most intriguingly for our story, they became the protectors of bloodlines and documents that certain people very much wanted to remain protected. When the Templars were suppressed in 1307, when their leaders were burned at the stake and their assets seized by King Philip IV of France, the official reason was charges of heresy and blasphemy. But the specific nature of those charges is telling. They were accused of worshipping false idols, of possessing secret knowledge that contradicted church teaching, and most significantly, of claiming to possess relics and documents that could challenge the very foundations of Christian authority in Europe. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned at the stake in Paris on the 18th of March, 1314. As the flames consumed him, he reportedly called out a curse on both King Philip and Pope Clement V, predicting that they would join him in death within a year. Both men died within months of his execution, but that's not the most interesting part of the story. The most interesting part is what de Molay didn't reveal under torture. Despite months of interrogation, despite the most sophisticated torture techniques the medieval world could devise, the Templar leadership never disclosed the location of their most precious treasures. Not their gold, which was valuable but replaceable. Their documents, their genealogies, their proof of the bloodlines they had been protecting for 2 centuries. The official story is that the Templar treasure was lost, scattered, hidden so well that it was never recovered. But there's another possibility. The possibility that it wasn't lost at all, but that it was successfully transferred to other organizations, other networks, other groups that understood its value and were prepared to continue the work of preservation. This is where the story connects to some of the most persistent legends in European history, the stories of secret societies that preserve ancient knowledge, the legends of bloodlines that carry special significance hidden among ordinary noble families, the persistent rumors of documents and artifacts that could rewrite the official history of Christian Europe if they ever came to light. But these aren't just legends, because every few generations, something surfaces that reminds the world that the Merovingian story isn't over. A document discovered in a monastery wall during renovation, a genealogy found in a private library that traces noble families back to bloodlines that officially died out centuries ago, archaeological discoveries that suggest the Merovingian kings possessed knowledge and artifacts that don't fit the official narrative of medieval European development. Each time something like this surfaces, it disappears again quickly. Sometimes it's purchased by private collectors and vanishes into secure vaults. Sometimes it's declared a forgery by academic authorities and dismissed from serious consideration. Sometimes it simply vanishes, and no one seems particularly interested in asking too many questions about where it went. The pattern is consistent enough that it suggests coordination, not necessarily conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but certainly a shared understanding among certain institutions about what kinds of historical evidence are helpful to preserve and what kinds are better left in obscurity. And this brings us to the most explosive part of the Merovingian story, because the bloodline didn't just preserve documents and genealogies. According to the evidence that has managed to surface over the centuries, they preserved knowledge about the true foundations of divine authority. Knowledge about bloodlines that connected European royalty to sources of legitimacy that predated and transcended the Christian Church's model of papal supremacy. This knowledge wasn't just historically interesting, it was politically explosive, because if the Merovingian claims were true, if their bloodline really did carry some form of divine authority that didn't depend on church recognition, then the entire structure of medieval European power was built on a lie. The Holy Roman Empire derived its legitimacy from the Pope's authority to anoint emperors. The Pope's authority came from his position as successor to Saint Peter. The whole system depended on the Church being the sole legitimate mediator between God and earthly rulers. But what if there was another source of divine authority? What if certain bloodlines carried within themselves a connection to divine power that bypassed the Church entirely? What if the Merovingians hadn't just been successful barbarian kings, but the inheritors of something that made church mediation unnecessary? These weren't just theological questions. They were questions that could topple governments, end dynasties, and reshape the entire political structure of European civilization. And that's why the cover-up wasn't just about suppressing the Merovingian bloodline. It was about suppressing the very idea that legitimate authority could come from anywhere other than the established institutions that controlled medieval Europe. But ideas, especially dangerous ideas, have a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts to erase them. They go underground, they adapt, they find new forms of expression, and they wait for moments when the established order shows cracks that might allow suppressed truths to emerge. The Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering classical learning, it was about questioning established authorities, including the Church's monopoly on legitimate knowledge. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just about religious doctrine, it was about challenging the entire structure of institutional authority that had dominated Europe for 1,000 years. And in both of these great historical movements, if you know what to look for, you can find traces of ideas that echo back to the Merovingian claims. Ideas about authority that comes from sources other than institutional recognition. Ideas about bloodlines that carry special significance. Ideas about knowledge that has been deliberately suppressed by those who benefit from the current power structure. The French Revolution of 1789 wasn't just about overthrowing an unpopular monarchy. It was about destroying the entire concept of divine right that had justified royal rule for 1,000 years. But here's what's fascinating about the revolutionary period. Even as the guillotine fell on Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, even as churches were desecrated and ancient symbols of authority were torn down, certain bloodlines quietly survived. The revolutionaries thought they were creating something entirely new, a republic based on reason rather than superstition, on merit rather than bloodline. But what they didn't understand was that some of the very ideas driving their revolution had ancient roots. Ideas about legitimate authority that came from sources other than kings appointed by God through papal approval. Ideas that traced back to concepts the Merovingians had represented centuries before anyone had heard of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Napoleon understood this better than most. When he crowned himself emperor in 1804, he didn't just reject papal authority over his coronation. He was making a statement about the nature of legitimate rule that echoed something much older than Enlightenment philosophy. He was claiming that true authority comes from within, from some indefinable quality that makes certain individuals natural leaders, regardless of what institutions might say about their legitimacy. But Napoleon's empire collapsed, as empires do. What survived was something more subtle, more persistent. The idea that somewhere in the bloodlines of European nobility there existed families who carried within themselves a different kind of authority. An authority that didn't depend on recognition from church or state, but existed as a natural right of inheritance. This is where the story moves from medieval chronicles into the modern age, where the cover-up takes on new forms adapted to a world of scientific skepticism and democratic ideals. Because you can't simply burn documents anymore when printing presses can create thousands of copies. You can't just execute troublesome witnesses when newspapers might ask uncomfortable questions. The methods had to evolve, but the goal remained the same: keep the Merovingian truth buried. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in genealogy, archaeology, and historical research. For the first time in European history, ordinary people had access to tools that could trace bloodlines back through centuries of records. University libraries opened their collections to scholars who weren't necessarily aligned with established institutions. Archaeological excavations began uncovering artifacts that told stories different from the official chronicles. This created both opportunities and dangers for those who understood what the Merovingian bloodline represented. Opportunities to finally prove claims that had been whispered about in secret for centuries. But also dangers that the wrong kind of evidence might fall into the wrong hands, or that amateur researchers might stumble onto truths they weren't prepared to handle responsibly. The response was elegant in its simplicity. If you can't suppress information in a democratic age, you control how it's interpreted. You fund the right kind of research while making sure the wrong kind never gets proper academic backing. You train scholars to recognize which interpretations are respectable and which mark someone as a fringe theorist not worth taking seriously. Most importantly, you flood the field with just enough misinformation to make it impossible for ordinary people to distinguish between legitimate historical research and fantasy. You encourage wild theories about alien bloodlines and mystical powers, while quietly ensuring that the real evidence never gets the serious scholarly attention it deserves. This strategy worked brilliantly. By the late 19th century, anyone who mentioned Merovingian bloodlines in academic circles was immediately associated with occultism, romanticism, or nationalist mythology. The real historical questions got buried under layers of sensationalized speculation that made serious researchers reluctant to touch the subject at all. But the bloodlines themselves didn't disappear. They adapted, as they always had. Noble families with Merovingian connections learned to downplay their genealogies, to present themselves as ordinary aristocrats rather than inheritors of something special. Secret societies that had preserved Merovingian documents for centuries became even more discreet, even more selective about who they trusted with their most dangerous secrets. The 20th century brought new challenges and new opportunities. 2 world wars devastated European aristocracy, scattered ancient families, and destroyed countless documents and artifacts. But they also created chaos that allowed certain things to be moved, hidden, or transferred without attracting the kind of attention they might have drawn in more stable times. The Nazi obsession with racial purity and ancient bloodlines created a particularly dangerous moment for Merovingian descendants. Hitler's regime wasn't just interested in promoting Aryan supremacy. They were actively researching bloodlines that might carry special significance, looking for ways to legitimize their authority through connection to ancient sources of power. Some Merovingian family lines found themselves targets of Nazi genealogical research. Others discovered that artifacts and documents their families had preserved for centuries suddenly became objects of intense interest from SS researchers who understood that controlling ancient symbols of authority could be as important as controlling armies. The Allied victory ended the immediate Nazi threat, but it didn't end the danger, because the Cold War created new reasons for powerful institutions to be interested in bloodlines that might carry special significance. Both the Americans and the Soviets understood that the loyalty of European populations might depend partly on their respect for traditional sources of authority, even if those sources had been officially obsolete for centuries. This led to some of the most sophisticated suppression efforts in the entire history of the Merovingian cover-up. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain developed expertise in genealogical research, not to promote ancient bloodlines, but to make sure they understood where those bloodlines were and what they might be capable of if they ever decided to assert themselves publicly. The result was a kind of stalemate. Merovingian descendants found themselves under subtle but constant surveillance, not persecuted, not eliminated, but watched. Their activities monitored, their associations noted, their access to certain kinds of historical documents quietly limited. At the same time, the cover-up adapted to the modern academic world. University departments that might have been interested in Merovingian research found their funding directed toward other projects. Scholarly journals developed editorial policies that made it difficult to publish research that challenged established narratives about medieval European development. Archaeological excavations that might have uncovered inconvenient artifacts were either never funded or saw their most interesting discoveries classified as too fragile for public display. But the most effective suppression technique was simply cultural. The 20th century was an age of democracy, science, and social progress. Ancient bloodlines and hereditary authority seemed like relics of a backward past that modern society had outgrown. Who cared about medieval royal genealogies when the real issues were economic development, technological advancement, and social justice? This cultural dismissal was more effective than any deliberate censorship could have been. It made the entire subject seem irrelevant to modern concerns, interesting only to amateur historians and romantic fantasists who had too much time on their hands and too little understanding of how the real world worked. Yet, beneath this surface dismissal, certain people continued to pay very close attention indeed, because bloodlines that had survived for 1,500 years, that had weathered the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the Crusades, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, multiple revolutions, and 2 world wars, were not going to simply fade away just because the modern world had decided they were no longer fashionable. The evidence of their persistence shows up in unexpected places. Art collectors who pay extraordinary prices for medieval artifacts with Merovingian connections, far more than their historical or aesthetic value would justify. Private libraries that contain genealogical documents never made available to public researchers. Charitable foundations that fund very specific types of historical research, while avoiding others that might raise uncomfortable questions. Most tellingly, there are the marriages. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, certain noble families with known Merovingian connections have consistently married within a surprisingly small circle of other families. Not random aristocratic families, but specific bloodlines that genealogical research suggests also carry traces of the ancient royal inheritance. These aren't love matches or political alliances in the traditional sense. They're too consistent, too carefully planned, too focused on maintaining very specific genetic combinations to be coincidental. They suggest that someone, somewhere, is still keeping track of bloodlines with the same care that medieval monasteries once used to preserve their most precious manuscripts. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the modern Merovingian story, because the cover-up isn't just historical anymore, it's ongoing, active, adaptive to contemporary conditions but still serving the same fundamental purpose it has served for over 1,000 years, making sure that certain truths about the nature of legitimate authority never become widely known. The methods have evolved with the times. Instead of burning books, information is buried in digital archives that require specialized access. Instead of executing troublesome witnesses, researchers find their careers stalled, their funding cut, their work dismissed by peer review processes that seem designed to discourage rather than encourage genuine inquiry. Instead of forcing Merovingian descendants into monasteries, they're encouraged to pursue careers in business, diplomacy, or philanthropy. Visible enough to be monitored, successful enough to be satisfied with their lives, but never quite positioned to use their bloodline connections to challenge established power structures. The most sophisticated aspect of the modern cover-up is how it uses the internet and mass media to create the illusion of transparency while actually making the truth harder to find than ever. There are thousands of websites, dozens of books, countless documentaries about Merovingian bloodlines. Most of them are filled with spectacular claims about Holy Grail legends, secret societies, and mystical powers that make the whole subject seem like entertainment rather than history. This flood of sensationalized material serves the same function that medieval chronicles once served. It controls the narrative. It makes sure that anyone who becomes interested in Merovingian bloodlines encounters a version of the story that's been carefully crafted to lead them away from the real evidence rather than toward it. The real evidence is still out there, in private archives that aren't digitized, in family records that haven't been donated to public institutions, in archaeological sites that haven't been excavated, or that have been excavated but whose most significant finds have been classified or quietly transferred to private collections. But finding that evidence requires resources, connections, and most importantly, the kind of institutional support that has been systematically denied to researchers who ask the wrong kinds of questions. It requires access to documents that are technically public but practically inaccessible. It requires funding for research that doesn't fit established academic categories. It requires the ability to connect dots across centuries of deliberately fragmented information. Most researchers don't have those resources. Most don't even know they need them, because they've been trained to think of Merovingian bloodlines as a subject that serious historians don't take seriously. They've been conditioned to see the whole topic as slightly disreputable, associated with conspiracy theories and romantic fantasies rather than legitimate historical inquiry. This conditioning is so effective that even researchers who stumble onto genuine evidence often dismiss it themselves. They assume that if something really significant had been discovered, it would already be widely known. They don't consider the possibility that significant discoveries might be systematically prevented from becoming widely known. But occasionally, despite all the safeguards, despite all the conditioning, despite all the carefully constructed barriers between researchers and evidence, something slips through. A document surfaces that shouldn't exist. An archaeological discovery reveals artifacts that don't fit the official timeline. A genealogical study traces bloodlines back further than anyone expected and reveals connections that raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of inherited authority. When this happens, when the cover-up shows cracks that might allow suppressed truths to emerge, the response is swift and sophisticated. The document is declared a forgery. The archaeological site is reclassified as too sensitive for public access. The genealogical research is dismissed as amateur work that doesn't meet professional standards. But the evidence doesn't disappear entirely. It joins the vast collection of suppressed information that has been accumulating for centuries, waiting for a moment when the established order might be weak enough distracted enough, or confident enough in its own security to allow some of these dangerous truths to finally see daylight. And that moment might be closer than the guardians of the cover-up realize, because the same technological advances that have made surveillance easier have also made information harder to control completely. The same global communications that allow coordination between institutions also allow coordination between researchers who understand that they're working on pieces of the same suppressed puzzle. The Merovingian bloodline has survived everything that 15 centuries of suppression could throw at it. It has adapted to every change in political systems, religious authority, and social organization. It has preserved its essential knowledge through the Dark Ages, the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age, and the Information Age. The descendants who carry this ancient inheritance have learned to be patient in ways that would astonish ordinary people. They think in generations, not election cycles. They plan in centuries, not quarterly reports. And they understand something that the architects of the modern cover-up have perhaps forgotten. That truth has its own momentum, its own inevitability, and its own way of surfacing when the conditions are right. What makes the current moment so dangerous for those who have worked so hard to keep the Merovingian secret buried is that we're living through the kind of systematic breakdown of established authority that historically creates opportunities for suppressed truths to emerge. Traditional institutions are losing credibility. Official narratives are being questioned. People are becoming skeptical of explanations that once would have been accepted without challenge. In this environment, the old methods of suppression don't work as well as they once did. You can't simply declare something a conspiracy theory and expect people to stop asking questions. You can't rely on institutional authority to settle debates when those institutions themselves are under scrutiny. You can't control information the way you could when there were only a handful of major media outlets and a small number of academic publishers. The keepers of the Merovingian secret understand this. They've been adapting their methods, developing new ways to manage information in an age of social media and alternative research platforms. But adaptation takes time, and mistakes happen, and sometimes the very technological tools being used for suppression create unexpected vulnerabilities. Digital archives that were supposed to make documents harder to find have occasionally made them easier to discover for researchers who know what they're looking for. Genealogical databases created for commercial purposes have revealed family connections that were supposed to remain hidden. Satellite archaeology has identified sites that might contain artifacts related to bloodlines that officially died out centuries ago. Each of these technological accidents creates a moment of opportunity, a brief window when information that has been carefully controlled for generations suddenly becomes accessible to people who weren't supposed to see it. Most of these windows close quickly, as systems are updated, access is restricted, and databases are modified to remove problematic entries. But some researchers have learned to move quickly when these opportunities arise. They've developed networks of their own, informal collaborations between genealogists, historians, archaeologists, and even data analysts who understand that they're working on different aspects of the same suppressed story. These modern networks operate with the same discretion that Merovingian preservation societies used centuries ago. They don't publish their findings in mainstream academic journals. They don't seek publicity or recognition. They simply gather evidence, verify it through multiple independent sources, and preserve it against the day when it might be safe to reveal what they've discovered. What they've discovered is extraordinary. Not the sensationalized claims about mystical powers and holy bloodlines that dominate popular treatments of the subject, but something far more concrete and far more politically explosive. Evidence that the Merovingian bloodline didn't just preserve genealogical records and ancient artifacts, They preserved proof. Proof of what exactly? That's where the story becomes not just historically fascinating, but contemporary in its implications. Because the proof they preserved relates to questions that are just as relevant today as they were in medieval Europe. Questions about the source of legitimate authority. Questions about whether power comes from institutions or from something deeper. Questions about what makes some people natural leaders, while others are natural followers. The Merovingians claimed that their authority came from their bloodline itself, not from recognition by church or state. For over 1,000 years, this claim has been dismissed as typical royal propaganda, the kind of divine right nonsense that rational people are supposed to have outgrown. But what if it wasn't propaganda? What if they actually possessed something that gave them a different kind of authority, something that could be measured, verified, and understood in scientific terms? Modern genetics has revealed that bloodlines carry far more information than anyone imagined even a generation ago. Not just physical characteristics, but behavioral tendencies, cognitive abilities, even predispositions towards certain kinds of leadership or social organization. What if the Merovingians understood something about inherited traits that mainstream science is only beginning to rediscover? This isn't about racial superiority or genetic determinism in the crude sense that these concepts have been misused in the past. It's about something more subtle and more specific. The possibility that certain bloodlines carry genetic combinations that produce individuals with unusual charismatic authority, strategic thinking abilities, or intuitive understanding of social dynamics. If this sounds far-fetched, consider how much we already know about genetic influences on personality, intelligence, and social behavior. Consider how certain families seem to produce generation after generation of natural leaders, successful entrepreneurs, or innovative thinkers. Consider how often positions of real power end up being held by people whose family histories show patterns of achievement that seem to go beyond mere privilege or opportunity. The Merovingians may have been the first European bloodline to understand these patterns systematically, to track them through genealogical records, and to use that understanding to maintain their authority across centuries of political change. They may have possessed something that modern leadership theory is only beginning to rediscover, the knowledge that true authority comes from within, from genetic and cultural inheritance that creates natural leaders rather than appointed ones. This knowledge would have been incredibly threatening to medieval institutions that based their power on the claim that authority flows from God through established hierarchies. It would be equally threatening to modern democratic institutions that base their legitimacy on the fiction that leadership ability is randomly distributed throughout the population. If the Merovingian claims were true, if certain bloodlines really do carry genetic advantages that make them natural leaders, then both medieval theocracy and modern democracy are built on false premises. Medieval kings weren't legitimate because the Pope anointed them. Democratic leaders aren't legitimate because the people elected them. True legitimacy would come from something much older and much more fundamental, the inheritance of traits that create natural authority. The political implications of this possibility explain why the cover-up has been so systematic and so enduring. It's not just about protecting the reputation of particular institutions or maintaining specific power structures. It's about protecting the entire conceptual framework that modern civilization uses to justify its organization. But here's what the architects of the cover-up may not have anticipated. Genetic research is advancing so rapidly that these questions may not remain theoretical much longer. Within decades, we may have the ability to identify specific genetic markers associated with leadership ability, strategic thinking, or charismatic authority. We may be able to trace these markers through historical bloodlines and determine whether certain families really do carry genetic advantages that others lack. When that becomes possible, when the questions that have been suppressed for centuries can finally be answered through objective scientific analysis, the Merovingian secret will either be definitively debunked or explosively confirmed. And given the lengths to which certain institutions have gone to prevent these questions from being asked, the smart money might be on confirmation. The descendants of the Merovingian bloodline understand this timeline. They know that the technological capabilities needed to prove their ancestral claims are developing faster than the institutional capabilities needed to suppress them. They've been preparing for this moment for generations, preserving not just genealogical records and historical documents, but genetic samples that can be analyzed when the science becomes sophisticated enough. Some of these samples come from artifacts preserved in family collections for centuries: hair from medieval combs, blood from ancient weapons, organic material from burial sites that have been secretly maintained by families who understood their significance long before anyone else recognized their scientific value. Other samples come from living descendants who have quietly participated in genetic research projects, contributing their DNA to databases that will someday allow comprehensive analysis of bloodlines that trace back to the early medieval period. These participants don't advertise their genealogical connections, but they make sure their genetic information is available for researchers who know what they're looking for. The result is that when the science finally becomes sophisticated enough to answer the fundamental questions about inherited leadership traits, the Merovingian bloodline will be ready with evidence that has been carefully preserved for exactly this moment. They will be able to prove not just their genealogical claims, but their genetic ones. This prospect terrifies the institutions that have worked so hard to keep Merovingian claims buried, because it would validate not just a particular bloodline, but an entire alternative understanding of legitimate authority. It would suggest that power doesn't flow from institutional recognition, but from inherited traits that some families carry and others don't. In a democratic age, this is perhaps the most subversive idea possible. It challenges not just particular governments or political parties, but the entire premise that all people are created equal in their capacity for leadership. It suggests that some bloodlines really are better suited to rule than others, not because of divine appointment or popular election, but because of genetic inheritance. The social implications of this possibility explain why the modern phase of the Merovingian cover-up has been so subtle and so sophisticated. Direct suppression would only draw attention to questions that are better left unasked. Instead, the strategy has been to make sure that when these questions do arise, they're framed in ways that make them seem either scientifically implausible or morally unacceptable. Scientific implausibility is maintained by ensuring that research into genetic influences on leadership ability remains fragmentary and theoretical. Funding goes to studies that examine these influences in abstract terms, but not to research that might trace specific traits through historical bloodlines or identify particular families that carry unusual genetic advantages. Moral unacceptability is maintained by associating any discussion of inherited leadership traits with historical atrocities committed by regimes that misused genetic concepts for political purposes. Anyone who suggests that some bloodlines might carry natural advantages is immediately compared to Nazi racial theorists or other discredited ideologies. This combination of scientific discouragement and moral stigma has been remarkably effective at preventing serious inquiry into questions that might validate Merovingian claims. But it's a defensive strategy that depends on maintaining control over both research funding and cultural narratives, and that control is becoming harder to maintain in an age of decentralized information and independent research networks. The breakthrough moment may come not from traditional academic research, but from the kind of citizen science that has already revolutionized fields like astronomy and archaeology. genetic genealogy enthusiasts who are mapping family trees through DNA analysis, independent researchers who are using artificial intelligence to identify patterns in historical documents, crowd-funded archaeological projects that bypass traditional institutional gatekeepers. These decentralized research networks don't depend on the approval of established institutions. They don't need funding from organizations that might have reasons to discourage certain lines of inquiry. They can ask questions that traditional academics have learned not to ask, and they can pursue evidence wherever it leads without worrying about career consequences. Some of these citizen scientists have already begun asking uncomfortable questions about bloodlines that show unusual patterns of achievement across multiple generations. They've identified genetic markers that seem to correlate with leadership ability. They've used artificial intelligence to analyze historical documents and identify families that may have preserved information about inherited traits long before modern genetics existed. Most importantly, they've begun connecting their findings with each other, creating informal networks of researchers who understand that they're working on pieces of the same larger puzzle. They may not know they're researching Merovingian bloodlines specifically, but they're rediscovering the same principles that the Merovingians understood centuries ago. These networks represent something that the traditional guardians of the cover-up have never had to face before. A research community that operates outside their control, uses methods they don't fully understand, and asks questions they thought they had successfully buried forever. The response has been predictable, but increasingly ineffective. Attempts to discredit citizen science as amateur work that doesn't meet professional standards. Efforts to flood the field with misinformation that makes it difficult to distinguish legitimate research from fantasy. Pressure on social media platforms and search engines to limit the visibility of content that raises uncomfortable questions about inherited traits. But these traditional suppression methods are struggling to keep pace with technological change. New platforms emerge faster than they can be controlled. Research methods evolve more quickly than countermeasures can be developed. Information spreads through networks that are too decentralized to monitor effectively. The result is that for the first time in centuries, the Merovingian secret is genuinely at risk of exposure, not through the kind of dramatic revelation that popular culture imagines, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence from multiple independent sources that becomes impossible to dismiss or suppress. When that moment comes, when the scientific proof of inherited leadership traits converges with the historical evidence of Merovingian bloodline preservation, the implications will extend far beyond academic history or genealogical curiosity. It will force a fundamental reconsideration of how authority works, where legitimacy comes from, and whether the democratic premise of equal capacity for leadership is scientifically supportable. The bloodline that has waited 15 centuries for vindication may finally be approaching the moment when their patient preservation of dangerous truths pays off in the most spectacular way possible, by proving that everything we think we know about power, authority, and leadership has been built on a carefully constructed lie, and the institutions that have worked so hard to maintain that lie are running out of time, running out of methods, and running out of ability to keep the truth buried, in an age when information wants to be free, and the tools for discovering it are becoming more powerful every day. The final phase of the Merovingian story may be about to begin. The signs are already beginning to show. In the past 5 years alone, genetic genealogy has solved cold cases that stumped law enforcement for decades, identified unknown victims from fragments of DNA, and traced family lines back through centuries with unprecedented accuracy. But more quietly, more discreetly, it has also begun revealing patterns that certain institutions would prefer remained hidden. Private genetic testing companies now possess DNA samples from millions of people worldwide. Their databases contain genetic information from families that have carefully guarded their bloodlines for generations, families that never intended to participate in scientific research but found themselves included when distant relatives submitted samples for ancestry testing. These accidental revelations have created opportunities that the traditional guardians of suppressed information never anticipated. Researchers who understand what they're looking for can now identify genetic markers associated with specific historical bloodlines without needing access to carefully guarded family records or restricted archaeological sites. The pattern analysis is revealing connections that were supposed to remain invisible. Families scattered across different countries, using different names, practicing different religions, but sharing genetic signatures that trace back to the same medieval sources. Bloodlines that were officially extinct continue to show up in the genetic record, preserved through marriages that seemed random, but now appear to have been carefully planned to maintain specific genetic combinations. Even more telling are the traits these bloodlines share. Not the mystical abilities that sensationalized accounts claim, but measurable characteristics that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Enhanced pattern recognition abilities, unusual capacity for strategic thinking under pressure, natural charismatic presence that makes others instinctively defer to their judgment. These aren't supernatural powers. They're genetic predispositions that can be identified, measured, and tracked through family trees with the same precision that medical researchers use to trace inherited diseases. And when you map these traits across the European noble families that have preserved Merovingian connections, the correlations become impossible to ignore. Intelligence agencies have been aware of these patterns for decades. Classified research programs have quietly studied the genetic basis of leadership ability, not for academic purposes, but because understanding inherited traits in ruling families has obvious strategic value. If certain bloodlines really do produce natural leaders more consistently than random genetic combinations, that information could be crucial for predicting political stability, identifying emerging power centers, or understanding why some dynasties endure while others collapse. But this research has always been conducted under strict security protocols, with results classified at levels that ensure they never reach public attention. The findings exist in secure databases that only a handful of people are authorized to access, and even those people are bound by clearance requirements that make disclosure impossible without risking prosecution under espionage laws. What the classification systems couldn't anticipate was the emergence of artificial intelligence systems capable of analyzing genetic data at scales that human researchers never imagined possible. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns in massive datasets that would take human analysts decades to recognize. They can correlate genetic markers with historical records, archaeological findings, and genealogical databases to create comprehensive pictures of bloodline inheritance that no previous technology could achieve. Some of these AI systems are now being applied to genetic genealogy research by citizen scientists who don't realize they're uncovering state secrets. They're using publicly available genetic databases, historical records that have been digitized for academic research, and processing power that would have been available only to intelligence agencies just a few years ago. The results they're generating are fragmentary and often misinterpreted, but the underlying patterns they're identifying are accurate enough to make certain institutional observers extremely nervous. Because when artificial intelligence systems start connecting genetic markers to historical bloodlines, when they begin identifying traits that correlate with leadership ability across multiple generations, they're essentially reverse engineering research that was supposed to remain classified forever. The traditional response would be to restrict access to the databases these systems depend on, but that's no longer practically possible. Genetic information has been distributed across too many platforms. Historical records have been digitized by too many institutions, and the processing tools are available to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. Instead, the response has been more subtle. Funding has appeared for research into the dangers of genetic discrimination, the ethical problems with artificial intelligence bias, and the historical misuse of biological concepts for political purposes. Academic conferences have been organized around themes that frame genetic research in leadership studies as inherently problematic. Media coverage has emphasized cases where genetic genealogy has produced false positives, or where AI analysis has reflected cultural biases rather than biological realities. The message being promoted is clear. This kind of research is not just scientifically unreliable, but morally dangerous, and responsible researchers should avoid it entirely. But the suppression campaign is fighting against technological momentum that may be impossible to stop. Every month, genetic databases grow larger and more comprehensive. Every year, artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated at identifying subtle patterns in complex data. Every advance in biotechnology makes it easier to extract genetic information from historical artifacts that were previously scientifically useless. The convergence of these technological capabilities is creating research opportunities that didn't exist even 5 years ago. Soon, it may be possible to extract usable DNA from medieval manuscripts written on parchment made from animal skins that carry genetic traces of the scribes who handled them. Archaeological sites that have been off-limits to researchers for decades may yield genetic evidence that can be analyzed without disturbing the sites themselves. Most significantly, the genetic markers associated with the traits that made Merovingian bloodlines special are becoming identifiable through analysis techniques that don't require cooperation from the families that carry them. Researchers who gain access to genetic databases can potentially identify Merovingian descendants without those individuals ever knowing they're being studied. This technological capability represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power between those who want to preserve secrets and those who want to uncover them. For the first time in centuries, the tools for discovering suppressed information are becoming more powerful than the tools for suppressing it. The implications extend beyond historical curiosity or genealogical research. If genetic analysis can definitively prove that certain bloodlines carry inheritable advantages in leadership ability, strategic thinking, or social influence, it would validate concepts that modern democratic societies have spent centuries trying to discredit. The foundational premise of democratic government is that leadership ability is distributed randomly throughout the population, that any citizen can potentially govern as effectively as any other, and that the legitimacy of rulers comes from popular consent rather than inherent qualifications. If genetic research proves that some families consistently produce better leaders than others, that democratic premise becomes scientifically untenable. Even more challenging would be the discovery that the families carrying these genetic advantages are the same bloodlines that ruled Europe for centuries before democratic governments replaced hereditary monarchies. It would suggest that the old systems of aristocratic rule weren't just traditional or cultural arrangements, but reflected biological realities that democratic ideologies have tried to ignore. The political establishment in every democratic country understands these implications, which is why genetic research into leadership traits receives so little public funding and so much subtle discouragement. The findings might validate not just specific bloodlines, but the entire concept of hereditary rule that democratic revolutions were supposed to have permanently discredited. But scientific truth has a way of emerging regardless of political preferences. and the truth about genetic influences on leadership ability is becoming harder to suppress as research methods become more sophisticated. The question is no longer whether these influences exist, but how significant they are and which bloodlines carry the most advantageous genetic combinations. The Merovingian descendants, who have preserved their genealogical records for 15 centuries, understand that this moment of scientific validation has been worth waiting for. They possess not just family trees that trace back to the early medieval period, but genetic samples that can be analyzed using techniques that didn't exist when their ancestors first began preserving evidence of their special inheritance. Some of these samples come from artifacts that have been carefully maintained in family collections for generations. Medieval jewelry that contains traces of the blood or hair of the original owners. Ancient weapons that carry genetic material from the warriors who wielded them. Religious relics that preserve biological evidence from the saints and kings who once touched them. Other samples come from more recent sources that were preserved with future scientific analysis in mind. Hair from combs used by family members who understood their genealogical significance. Blood samples taken during medical procedures and stored under conditions that preserve DNA integrity. Even dental records and medical specimens that can yield genetic information decades after they were collected. The result is that when genetic analysis finally becomes sophisticated enough to identify the specific markers associated with inherited leadership traits, the Merovingian bloodline will be ready with evidence that spans over 1,000 years of genetic inheritance. They will be able to prove not just their genealogical claims, but their biological ones. This preparation has been conducted with the same discretion that characterized Merovingian preservation efforts throughout their hidden centuries. The genetic samples have been stored in private facilities rather than institutional repositories. The genealogical records have been maintained by family members rather than academic researchers. The analysis, when it comes, will be conducted through independent laboratories rather than university programs. The goal is not just to prove Merovingian claims, but to do so in a way that bypasses the institutional filters that have suppressed this information for so long. By the time the results become public, it will be too late for traditional suppression methods to prevent their dissemination. But the Merovingians aren't the only bloodline that has been preparing for this moment. Throughout Europe, families with connections to other ancient royal lines have been quietly preserving their own genetic evidence and genealogical records. Some of these families intermarried with Merovingian descendants over the centuries, creating hybrid bloodlines that combine genetic advantages from multiple sources. So here we are, 15 centuries after Childeric first emerged from those misty Gallic forests, standing at the threshold of the most dangerous moment the guardians of this secret have ever faced. The bloodline that survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the Crusades, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, 2 world wars, and the digital age may finally be approaching its moment of vindication. And when that moment comes, when genetic science converges with historical evidence to prove what the Merovingians have always claimed, everything we think we know about power, authority, and the very nature of leadership will have to be rewritten. The greatest cover-up in Western civilization is running out of time to keep its secrets buried.